Joining us now live on the Newsline is Pete Sepp. Mr. Sepp is president of the National Taxpayers Union. We have spoken to folks from NTU, including Mr. Sepp, on prior occasions. Good morning, sir. Thanks for coming back on the program.
Always great to be here.
For those who have missed some of those prior conversations, though, remind us, National Taxpayers Union, who are you folks and what do you do?
We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizen group founded in 1969 to work for lower, fairer, simpler taxes, less wasteful government spending, and economic liberty at all levels of government. We've had a great relationship with activists in Iowa going back to the late, great David Stanley.
Someone I have had on the radio, probably the first time was some 40 years ago, which is dating everybody involved in this conversation. And you've been involved with NTU for more than a minute yourself.
Yeah, 38 years in various capacities. They just kept making the mistake of promoting me.
Well, there's also the mistake of federal government in needing oversight like NTU provides, and that's the topic of the conversation today. The debt crisis, the spending crisis, the inability or lack of desire by folks in Washington on all sides of the aisle, all parts of the city, they don't want to control spending. What is the ramification of that if that is, in fact, their mindset?
Well, Jeff, we've warned for the better part of 60 years now that sooner or later the federal government's bad spending habits would catch up with the economy, and they are really starting to do that. It's easy to say that some future generation is going to have to pay off the national debt or deal with the fiscal crisis that current generations have left them. That's no longer the case. Those current generations, all of us, are now suffering under federal debt that is now 101% of our annual economic output and will soon climb to 120%. Those are record levels for peacetime, and they are unsustainable. We are already coping with the fact that we spend more money to service our national debt every year than we spend on national defense. That is money that is going to nothing. It doesn't make us safer. It doesn't make us better off. It doesn't make our roads somehow work better. None of that money spent on debt interest is doing a thing except paying for previous spending out of an empty pocket. It's got to stop. And the best part is, I think, the silver lining is, there is a bipartisan or nonpartisan or transpartisan, whatever you want to call it, consensus developing among the American people that growing the economy and reducing federal spending is the way out of this problem rather than raising taxes. And a recent poll we conducted shows that.
We used to talk about this and say it's like monopoly money because it did not seem real. Well, there's not this kind of money in the game of Monopoly even. I mean, it's hard for us to comprehend when you're talking about a deficit of $1.9 trillion with a T dollars this year alone.
Yeah, that's right. And the problem is we don't have the same kind of fiscal capacity to deal with the debt crisis that we did even 10 years ago before the pandemic hit. But after the big financial meltdown of 2008, we still had some room to be able to say, okay, we have to approach the coming demise of Social Security and Medicare's trust funds. We have time to get our revenue side of the ledger in order. We have time to gradually restrain the growth of certain federal benefit programs. That time ran out, not just because of the passage of 10 years, but also because of the accelerated borrowing. Now, for example, we are facing the demise of the Social Security Retirement Trust Fund in 2032. What that means is that by law, automatically, Social Security benefits will be reduced by more than 20% across the board. That bears repeating because we need to understand the time frame. In 6 years, the term of every senator who stands for re-election in 2026 will be the time we face a very serious crisis with Social Security. Medicare Part A, the hospital insurance, is not far behind that. The Highway Trust Fund, in which we put a lot of gasoline taxes in order to keep up roads and whatnot, that actually faces an even earlier demise in 2028. These are problems that we've ignored for a very long time and really cannot afford to do so anymore.
Pete Sepp is president of the National Taxpayers Union. NTU.org is their excellent website. He joins us live on News Talk 1540 KXEL. I want to talk about the polling that you mentioned in a moment, but while many of us understand the impact of government spending on our own pocketbook, how does that impact the ability of business and industry to grow? As you noted, even after 2008, we were able to absorb things, but we're not in 2026 in the same way. Talk about that if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the problem is the so-called crowding out effect. The more government spends and borrows, the harder it is to get credit at decent rates in the private sector. We've seen how stubborn interest rates have been, and attempts by the Federal Reserve to lower the prime lending rate, and the problem of trying to balance that against fighting inflation, which ironically federal overspending can actually contribute to. And so we're kind of caught between these two poles of higher interest rates and higher inflation, and trying to find a balance between the two. Businesses are having a very difficult time coping with those. Add into the fact that we have trade wars going on, along with many of the products that Iowa produces and exports to the world, and they're caught in the middle of these trade wars, which can make markets abroad very difficult for Iowa's products to access. All of that adds up to unemployment problems, the fact that businesses may have to lay off workers or raise prices or disappoint shareholders. And at the center of a lot of this, not all of it, but a lot of it, is bad policy choices by the federal government.
The National Taxpayers Union partnered with Public Opinion Strategies for a poll of registered voters. You alluded to it earlier. Give us a sense of how we, the people, feel about all this.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You would expect that if 800 registered voters with the typical party breakdown that occurs nationally, that you would see Republicans, for example, saying, of the 3 ways to reduce the debt, which is the most effective way to reduce that debt? Well, in the GOP, 75% said cutting government spending. 22% said growing the economy. Just 1% said raising taxes. Okay, that's to be expected, but look at the results among Democrats. 34% said cutting government spending was the best way out of the debt. 39% growing the economy. Only 26% said raising taxes. I'm not sure that the national leadership of the Democratic Party is aware of the fact that only 1 in 4 of their rank-and-file members think that raising taxes is the best way out of this problem. And even if you ask the question by ideology, which we did, progressives, probably the most left-leaning constituency you can think of, 44% of them thought raising taxes was the good idea. Okay, but still a solid majority, 54% of them, chose cutting spending or growing the economy. That is a pretty incredible result across the partisan and the ideological spectrum. It suggests that elected officials are not listening to the American people. They're listening to special interests to keep on spending.
Do the American people, based upon the research, have a sense that this is a real problem, or is it one of these headlines that no matter how many times we see it, we just kind of gaze past it because we're worried about our own daily lives, our own budget, or are they related?
I think they are related. It's very easy for your eyes to glaze over when you see 12, 15 zeros after a number and say, billion, million, trillion, what's the difference? But there are differences that people are feeling in their own daily lives. Inflation is an example. The fact that tariffs are raising the costs of certain goods. The fact that businesses, despite all of the tax reductions that were badly needed through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, are still struggling, despite the fact that it is difficult to afford homes and whatnot, and wondering, well, is there a connection to government spending and borrowing here? I think typical families across the United States are starting to make that connection.
We all understand that if we run out of money and we have to put it on a credit card, get a loan, etc., well, we know what payment schedules look like. We see the interest applied to the bill, and at some point we just run out of money and run out of credit. The federal government just prints more money. And
Yes.
we all understand a budget deficit, but apparently Washington either does not or chooses to ignore it because of their own agenda, namely getting reelected, having power, and currying favor with voters by handing out piles of money at election time.
Yeah, I think they're currying favor with very narrow slices of voters, not necessarily the majority of voters. And what we are now seeing, I believe, is the very real effects of these policies. You can't really ignore the fact anymore that the federal government's credit rating is being eroded. There have been downgrades of the federal credit rating. States have often been very careful about protecting their bond ratings. The federal government, for years, federal elected officials said, well, we're the sovereign borrower of the entire United States. Nobody can hurt our credit rating. Not true. There have been several downgrades now since the early 2010s, and more are on the way to not only make the borrowing costs more expensive, but the servicing costs more expensive, and that has real-world consequences we are feeling.
So in our remaining moments with Pete Sepp, President, National Taxpayers Union, NTU.org, what's the solution? Because we need to know what the problem is, and you've articulated that very well, but what do we do to fix it?
There are multiple approaches. One, a budget resolution that was bipartisan in nature to hit a 3% of annual economic output deficit target. That means to cut in half the federal deficit we currently have. That's progress because it's bipartisan. There are a whole list of budget reforms that we have recommended through our National Taxpayers Union Foundation to give incentives for federal agencies to not spend all the money they have at the end of the year. There are structural changes we can make to both Social Security and Medicare that will ease some of the financial problems of those two big programs. We also have to consider a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution, something that David Stanley championed for years and is still urgently needed. So we have solutions ranging from the relatively small to the comprehensive. The point is we've got to start on them now.
Has to be taken seriously, and yesterday would have been better. Today is fine. Tomorrow may be too late. NTU.org, National Taxpayers Union, the website and the organization. President of NTU, Pete Sepp, thanks so much for the excellent conversation. Your group does such great work, and you're welcome here anytime.
Oh, thank you. It'll be a pleasure to be on again.